Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. When Donald Trump landed in Beijing, most of the headlines focused on the optics. The red carpets, the military honors, the smiling handshakes, the carefully staged state dinner. And if you only watched the official footage, you might think the United States and China were entering some kind of new era of cooperation. But that's not what was really happening. Because underneath all the ceremony, something much bigger was being exposed. This trip revealed the single biggest contradiction in American strategy right now. On one side, Washington keeps telling Americans that China is the United States' greatest strategic competitor. On the other side, some of America's most powerful corporations still desperately want access to the Chinese market. And that contradiction is becoming harder and harder to hide. That's why this visit matters. Not because of the diplomatic theater, not because of the press conferences, and not because Trump and Xi suddenly trust each other. This visit matters because it showed us what the next phase of the US-China relationship is probably going to look like. Not full cooperation. Not a new Cold War either. But something much more unstable. Two superpowers competing against each other while remaining deeply economically connected. And, historically, those kinds of relationships can become extremely dangerous. Because the hardest rival to deal with is not the one you're completely separated from. It's the one you still depend on. That's the world we're entering now. And honestly, I think a lot of Americans still underestimate how profound this shift really is. For years, people in Washington talked about engagement with China as if it would eventually turn China into something more politically compatible with the West. That was basically the assumption after the Cold War. Bring China into the global economy. Open trade, expand investment, build supply chains together, and eventually, economic integration would create political convergence. But that's not what happened. Instead, China became richer, stronger, more technologically advanced, and far more geopolitically ambitious. Meanwhile, the United States slowly realized that globalization had created a strategic dependency problem. Entire American industries became dependent on Chinese manufacturing. Critical supply chains moved overseas. Industrial capacity weakened. And suddenly, Washington started asking a question it hadn't seriously asked in decades. What happens if America's biggest geopolitical rival also becomes economically indispensable? That question changed everything. And that's really the background behind Trump's trip to Beijing. Because what we're watching now is not simply diplomacy. We're watching two systems trying to renegotiate the terms of coexistence. And one of the most revealing parts of the visit had nothing to do with politicians at all. It was the business delegation. Think about who traveled with Trump. Tim Cook from Apple, Elon Musk from Tesla, Jensen Huang from Nvidia, Wall Street executives, major financial institutions. Some of the most powerful corporate figures in the American economy. Now ask yourself, if America is supposedly decoupling from China, why are America's biggest companies still rushing to Beijing? That question gets to the heart of the entire issue. Because the reality is that America is not truly separating from China. At least not completely. What's actually happening is more complicated. Washington wants to reduce dangerous dependencies. But corporate America still wants profits, market access, manufacturing capacity, and growth opportunities. Those are not always the same thing. And this tension is becoming one of the defining political and economic struggles inside the United States itself. The U.S. government increasingly views China through a national security lens. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, Taiwan, cybersecurity, rare earth minerals, military competition, supply chain resilience. But multinational corporations often view China through a business lens. Consumers, factories, revenue, production scale, market share. That difference matters. Because governments think in terms of strategic risk, corporations think in terms of quarterly earnings. And right now, America is trying to do something historically very difficult. Compete with China strategically without completely blowing up the global economic system. That's not easy, especially because China is no longer just another developing economy. China is deeply embedded into the structure of global capitalism itself. That's why even after tariffs, export controls, tech restrictions, and years of geopolitical tension, American business leaders are still showing up in Beijing. Because the Chinese market is still enormous. Because China is still central to global manufacturing. Because replacing China is far harder than many politicians make it sound. And honestly, this is where I think a lot of political narratives become oversimplified. Some commentators talk as if America has already escaped dependence on China. Others talk as if China is inevitably replacing the United States. Both narratives miss the complexity of what's actually happening. Yes, the United States has become more aggressive about reducing strategic vulnerabilities. That's real. You can see it in semiconductor restrictions. You can see it in reshoring efforts. You can see it in the expansion of manufacturing in Mexico and other allied countries. You can see it in energy policy. You can see it in the push for domestic industrial capacity. America is clearly trying to rebuild strategic leverage. But that does not mean China is collapsing. And it definitely does not mean America can easily walk away from the Chinese economy. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes people make is confusing de-risking with decoupling. Those are not the same thing. De-risking means reducing vulnerabilities in critical sectors. Decoupling would mean truly separating the two economies. And we are nowhere near full decoupling. Not even close. Apple still depends heavily on Chinese manufacturing. Tesla still relies heavily on Chinese sales and production. American retailers still depend on Chinese goods. Global supply chains still run through China in countless ways. And China itself remains an industrial powerhouse unlike anything the world has seen in modern history. That's another thing many Americans underestimate. China's real strength isn't just cheap labor anymore. Actually, the cheap labor China narrative is outdated. China's real advantage today is industrial scale, infrastructure, engineering capacity, manufacturing ecosystems, logistics networks, supply chain integration, massive domestic production capability. That's much harder to replicate than people realize. You can move a factory, but rebuilding an entire industrial ecosystem is another story. And this is where the Taiwan issue becomes so important. Because Taiwan isn't just a geopolitical flashpoint, it's also tied directly to technology, semiconductors, global supply chains, and economic power. When Chinese officials warn that Taiwan is the most dangerous issue in the US-China relationship, they're not exaggerating. From Beijing's perspective, Taiwan is connected to sovereignty, legitimacy, nationalism, and strategic security. From Washington's perspective, Taiwan is connected to regional balance of power, semiconductor supply chains, alliance credibility, and deterrence. That's why this issue is so dangerous. Because both sides see it as strategically vital, and neither side wants to appear weak. At the same time, neither side actually wants a catastrophic war. At least, not intentionally. That creates a very unstable situation. Because historically, great power conflicts often emerge not when both sides actively seek war, but when both sides are trying to avoid losing strategic position. That's what makes the current moment so tense. China wants America to reduce support for Taiwan. America wants to deter China without triggering direct confrontation. Both countries are trying to manage escalation while continuing to compete. And the economic relationship complicates everything. Because unlike the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the United States and China are economically intertwined. Deeply intertwined. The Soviet Union was largely outside the Western economic system. China is inside it. That changes the entire dynamic. A military crisis involving China would not just be a military crisis. It would immediately become an economic crisis, a technological crisis, a financial crisis, a supply chain crisis, potentially a global recession. That's one reason both Washington and Beijing continue trying to maintain some form of communication even during periods of tension. And honestly, I think that's part of what this summit was really about. Not friendship, not trust, not ideological alignment, but stabilization, managing competition without letting it spiral out of control. Now, one thing I found especially interesting in the commentary surrounding this trip was the idea that Trump is not actually trying to end globalization. He's trying to redesign it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. For years, people described Trump as anti-globalization, but I don't think that's entirely accurate. What Trump and many America First strategists seem to want, is not the destruction of global trade. They want a different version of globalization. One, centered more around American interests, allied supply chains, and strategic resilience. That's why agreements like the USMCA matter. That's why Mexico has become increasingly important. That's why friendshoring became such a popular concept in Washington. The idea is basically this. The United States should remain at the center of the global economic system, but critical supply chains should move away from geopolitical rivals. That's not isolationism. It's strategic restructuring. And whether people support Trump or not, this shift is happening across much of the American political establishment now. Even many Democrats who strongly oppose Trump still support industrial policy, semiconductor investment, supply chain security, and tougher competition with China. That's important to understand. Because the U.S.-China rivalry is no longer just a temporary political issue. It's becoming structural, a long-term feature of the international system. And I think China understands that too. Which is probably one reason Beijing has become more focused on stability in recent years. China's leadership understands that the country faces real economic pressures, property market issues, debt problems, demographic decline, weak consumer confidence, local government financial strain, slower growth. At the same time, China also understands that external instability could make those internal problems worse. So Beijing's strategy increasingly seems to focus on preventing total deterioration in U.S.-China relations while still protecting core interests. That's why Chinese messaging often emphasizes managing differences and stable coexistence. But stability doesn't mean trust. And this is where I think some Western commentary becomes misleading. There's a tendency in some circles to frame every sign of Chinese economic difficulty as proof that China is about to collapse. I don't buy that. China absolutely faces major problems. But large powers rarely collapse quickly, especially industrial civilizations with enormous state capacity. The Soviet Union analogy gets overused all the time. China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet economy was relatively isolated and structurally rigid. China is integrated into global trade, manufacturing, finance, and technology networks in ways the Soviet Union never was. China also has a much larger industrial base and a far deeper connection to global markets. That doesn't mean China will inevitably overtake the United States, but it does mean simplistic, China is finished, narratives are probably unrealistic. And honestly, I think Americans should avoid becoming too overconfident, because one of the most dangerous habits in geopolitics is underestimating your competitor. China is advancing rapidly in areas like electric vehicles, battery technology, industrial automation, AI applications, robotics, infrastructure construction, and manufacturing scale. In some sectors, China is no longer merely catching up. It's becoming a co-leader. That's why the next decade will probably not look like a simple American victory or a simple Chinese victory. It's more likely to look like prolonged strategic competition between two massive systems with very different strengths. And that competition is going to reshape global politics. Energy markets, technology standards, trade routes, financial systems, military alliances, artificial intelligence, supply chains, even internet governance. Everything is increasingly connected to this rivalry now. Which brings us back to Trump's visit. Because symbolically, this trip represented something bigger than diplomacy. It represented the transition into a new phase of the international order. The old assumptions are breaking down. The post-Cold War era was built on the idea that economic integration would gradually reduce geopolitical conflict. Instead, the world discovered that economic integration can coexist with strategic rivalry. That changes the rules. Now countries are trying to balance prosperity with security, efficiency with resilience, globalization with sovereignty, and nobody really knows exactly where the balance point is yet. That uncertainty is driving political instability all over the world. You can see it in Europe. You can see it in the United States. You can see it in debates over immigration, industrial policy, energy, trade, and national identity. Even the rise of populist movements in the West is connected to these larger economic transformations. A lot of people felt that the old global system benefited financial elites more than ordinary workers. That frustration created space for political movements that challenged the existing order. Trump in America, Brexit in Britain, nationalist parties across Europe. These movements didn't emerge in a vacuum. They emerged from social discontent tied to globalization, cultural change, economic insecurity, and distrust of institutions. And whether people love Trump or hate him, he became one of the most important political symbols of that shift. That's another reason this China trip matters politically, because it wasn't just about foreign policy. It was also about the image Trump wants to project domestically: strength, negotiation, economic leverage, industrial revival, strategic competition, America first, without complete isolation. That's the political brand. At the same time, Xi Jinping is also projecting an image: stability, continuity, civilizational confidence, national rejuvenation, resistance to Western pressure. Both leaders are performing for multiple audiences simultaneously: domestic audiences, international audiences, business elites, allies, rivals, financial markets. And beneath all the symbolism, the underlying question remains unresolved. Can the United States and China compete intensely without eventually sliding into direct confrontation? That is probably the most important geopolitical question of the 21st century, because the stakes are enormous. We're not talking about two minor powers. We're talking about the world's two largest economies, two technological giants, two military superpowers, two completely different political systems. And unlike previous rivalries, these two systems are deeply interconnected economically. That interconnectedness creates both restraint and vulnerability. It discourages war because the economic consequences would be catastrophic. But it also creates leverage, dependency, and fear. And fear is dangerous in international politics, especially when both sides suspect the other side is trying to weaken them strategically. That's why supply chains matter now. That's why semiconductor production matters. That's why rare earth minerals matter. That's why energy routes matter. That's why artificial intelligence matters. These aren't just economic issues anymore. They're strategic issues, national security issues. And honestly, I think we're only at the beginning of this transformation. The next phase of globalization will probably look very different from the last one. Less naive, more fragmented, more regionalized, more security-focused. Countries are increasingly asking not just, is this efficient? But, is this safe? That mindset shift is huge. And it's reshaping everything from trade policy to corporate strategy. Even companies now have to think geopolitically in ways they didn't before. A decade ago, many corporations treated geopolitics as background noise. Today, geopolitical risk can determine stock prices, investment decisions, manufacturing locations, and long-term strategy. That's a major change. And this is why I think the most important takeaway from Trump's Beijing trip is not whether the summit looked friendly or hostile. The real takeaway is that both countries now understand they are entering a prolonged strategic competition that neither side can easily escape. The United States is trying to reduce dependence on China while preserving economic strength. China is trying to maintain growth while resisting American pressure. Both are attempting to reshape the international system in ways favorable to themselves. And both know the other side is doing the same thing. That's the reality. This is no longer the era of optimistic globalization. But it's also not a simple new Cold War. It's something more complicated, a world where economic integration and geopolitical rivalry exist at the same time. A world where the United States and China still need each other economically while increasingly distrusting each other strategically. A world where every trade dispute can become a national security issue. Where every technology breakthrough can become a geopolitical weapon. Where every supply chain becomes politically significant. And honestly, I think we're entering a period that historians may eventually describe as one of the great transitions of modern history. Because what's really being negotiated right now is not just trade policy, it's the future structure of global power. Who controls advanced technology? Who dominates industrial production? Who shapes international institutions? Who writes the rules of the next economic era? And unlike the unipolar moment after the Cold War, this competition is happening in a world where power is becoming more distributed and more contested. That makes the future less predictable and potentially more unstable. But one thing already seems clear. The era when the United States believed China would simply become another participant in an American-led global order is over. And the era when China could rise economically without triggering a major strategic response from Washington is over too. Now, both countries are adapting to a new reality: long-term competition, mutual dependence, strategic distrust, economic interconnection, and neither side fully knows where this process ultimately leads. That uncertainty may be the most important part of the story, because history becomes especially dangerous during transitions. When old systems are weakening, when new systems haven't fully formed yet, when nations are trying to redefine their place in the world, that's the phase we're entering now. And Trump's visit to Beijing was not the resolution of that story. It was the beginning of a much larger chapter. Thanks for watching.